Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. We're in week 16 and this week we're going to finish off our trio of flower garland pieces that we've been working on over the last couple of weeks. There will be links to the other videos in this trio along the way, so do look out for the cards at the top of the screen. I'm going to be working on my green grass fabric and I've got my 20 by 20 centimetre square here. I've got some scraps of the fabrics that I've been using on these flower garland blocks so far, and this time I've also got a bit of my bug patterned fabric that inspired the colour scheme for this quilt. I've got some Bondaweb and I've got my iron off camera as well, and then I've got threads in the colours that I've been using for my flower garland. So I've got my mid green, which is Anchor 258. I've got my red, which is Anchor 46, my blue, which is Anchor 130, my pink, which is Anchor 025, my bright yellow, which is 298, my white, which is 001, and I've also brought in my darkest green, which is Anchor 683, although I don't think I'm going to use it. I've got some machine cotton because we're going to be using that to join this block with the other two that we've made. I've got some marking tools and my quilting ruler, and then I've got some paper scissors because we're using Bondaweb and my embroidery scissors. Now I've also got my week 8 pattern, and this is the one for the first flower garland block that we made. It's available on our website. There will be a link in the description. I've also got my other two blocks that we finished last week, and I've marked a seam allowance on the left hand side because that's where this block is going to join. If you didn't see last week's video, I will link it in a card at the top of the screen. Now this seam allowance I have measured from the right hand side of the block, and I've just made sure that I've marked 18 centimetres across. So I haven't marked from the side of the pale blue fabric, I've marked measuring from the seam that I created last week, and that makes sure that any inaccuracies in cutting are accounted for, and the finished size of my block will be 18 centimetres square. So I've got that handy and I'll be using that a bit later. So I'm going to start by making some little motifs, and we did this back in week 2 when we made our kitchen window panel, and we just took the little illustrations from the fabric and turned them into panes of a window, and we're going to do something very similar to that today. So this is my week 2 template. This is available on our website. It's £1 to download. That cost just helps me keep this channel running, and if you've already downloaded it, you really don't need to download it again. You could just cut some little rectangles, but if you do want to download it, the address is at the bottom of the screen and there's a direct link in the description below. So I'm going to start off by drawing around 2 of my windows onto my Bondaweb. So I've got the rough side, the glue side of the Bondaweb is down on the paper, and the paper side of the Bondaweb is up, and I'm just drawing around that in pencil on the paper side. I'm not going right up to the edge because when we adhere this to the fabric, we want the glue to go right to the edge of our shape. That's all I'm going to need that pattern for, so really don't download it more than once if you don't have to. And I'm just going to roughly cut these out. You can see there that there's a little bit of excess around the edge of the shape that I've drawn, and that's going to help us get a really precise finish when we've attached it to the fabric. I don't want too much excess though, so I'm just going to trim that off a little bit, and I'm going to keep that bit handy because it will come in useful later. So now I'm putting the right side of the fabric down, so I'm working on the wrong side here, and I'm just looking for some little features of this pattern that I can use to make my little stamps, if you like, my little window panes or motifs. I do quite like these sprays of flowers here. it does look a little bit paler because I'm working on the back, but I do like that one. I'm going to just bring in my ironing mat so that once I've decided what I'm going to capture, I don't have to move it. I think I like this flower here actually, so there's far too many options, and I did faff about with this for quite a long time. I quite like this red spray here. I think that's going to be quite a nice one, so I think I'm going to stick with that one. I just quite like the fact that it's got some dark colours on it as well as the red that will appear in the rest of the block. So I'm going to position my bonder web so that it's nicely centred over the shape, and then I'm just going to clamp my iron down on that for about 10 seconds. You can see I'm not moving my iron. I don't want to slide the bonder web across the fabric, I just want to hold it in place, and that process just melts the glue of the bonder web onto the fabric. So you just need to make sure that your glue side of the bonder web is down on the back of the fabric, and make sure you're working on the reverse of the fabric at this stage. So there's a nice little butterfly up there that I quite like, but I do quite like this flower. It's going to allow me to have one vertical motif and one horizontal. So I just attach my bonder web rectangle in exactly the same way. Now I'm just going to cut those out. This is why we leave a little bit of overhang. So this is where I cut precisely, and that means there will be glue to the very edges of these shapes, and it will mean that they stick really nicely when we iron them onto our panel. So I'm just using long cutting motions of my scissor blades. It would have been better to use a longer bladed scissor, and that keeps it nice and straight. So just to help me position, I'm going to mark in my seam allowance, and I don't need to be too precise at this stage. I just want a rough guide to the outer limits of my finished block. So I'm just going to measure in 1 centimetre from each side and marking that with my heat erase pen because I don't need it for very long. I've got a little scrap of my blue fabric here, and I'm peeling the paper backing off my bonder web, and I just want to sit these little motifs on a blue background just so that I'm echoing that design from block 2, and I'm just going to position them so that the top edge there is already the right size. I'm just checking that with a ruler, allowing a 0.5 centimetre border all around my shape, and then I just clamp my iron down on that, and that's going to fuse my fabric motifs onto that blue backing. So just at this point you need to make sure you've got the back of the fabric down so that you don't melt your glue onto your iron. So I've just got my cutting mat in here. I'm lining up my 0.5 centimetre line with a line on my cutting mat to make sure I've got a 0.5 centimetre border around that left hand side of the motifs, and I'm just rolling my rotary cutter down, and then I'm going to separate those out in exactly the same way, just straightening off that edge there and ensuring that I've got a neat finish all the way around. Now that little trimming that I took off the bonder web, I'm going to use almost like blue tack, so to save wasting it, I've just got these little tiny patches of bonder web, and I'm just going to attach them onto the back of the blue so that I can position them onto my block when the time comes and they're not going to move. So at this point I just need to plan out where my flower garlands are going to be, so that when I stick down my little patches that I've just made, I'm not going to overlap where the flowers are going to be. We did this process last week, so what I've done here is folded back the seam allowance, and I've lined that up with the inner line on my flower garland quilt so that I can take into account the fact that 1 centimetre on that right hand side of the block is going to form the seam. And I'm just eyeballing it really. I'm just following the line of the garland and extending it out to the left, and I thought after I'd put in that first line I thought it needed to go a bit further out to the left, so I've just added in a slightly different line there, and you can see that those lines sweep down quite smoothly and effectively. So just to help you out, if you measure from the top right of the block, this first line comes 11 centimetres across from the top left hand corner, and the second line goes to 13.5 centimetres across and then just sweeps down. So now I've got those lines in, I've got an idea of where my flower garland's going to be, and that's going to help me position my two little windows that I've made. So I'm just putting those on my backing fabric and clamping my iron down, and that melts those two little patches of Bondaweb to hold those in place while I add my embroidery. Now I want to make sure that these don't fall off as the quilt is used, and so I'm just going to add in some stitching, and I'm going to echo the stitching that I did on my block 2. So I've got 2 strands of my white thread here, and I'm going round that inside rectangle with the pattern on it just with a simple running stitch, and we covered running stitch last week. If you're not sure how to do this, you can head over to that video and check that out. It's really simple. It's just up through the fabric along a bit and down, and you just work your way around the shape in that way. It's the simplest of all stitches. So I've gone round the inside of my little window pane there, and I now want to blanket stitch around the blue. So I haven't finished off my thread, I've just come up on the outside edge of the blue, and I want to imagine that there's a little square here that's going to form my blanket stitches. So I'm going to take my needle down diagonally across from where my threads come up at the edge, and that makes a little loop in my thread, and then I'm going to rock my needle so that it comes back out of the fabric at the edge of the blue and inside that loop, and when I pull through, my loop catches on my working thread and pulls into a right angle. So now I go diagonally down again to the right, rock my needle forward so that it comes out directly above where I've just taken it down and inside the loop, and pull it into my little right angle, and diagonally down again, rock my needle forward into the loop and pull through, and I just carry on like that all the way along the edge. Now I have got lots of stitch tutorials. I will put the playlist of all my stitch tutorials in a card at the top of the screen, so if there are any stitches in any of my videos that you're not sure about, I've probably got some instructions to help you, so do check that out if you need a little bit of guidance. It's always worth me just showing you how I do my corners neatly in blanket stitch. So you can see I'm doing my last stitch here lined up with the edge of the patterned patch, and so that allows me to now make a stitch diagonally out into the corner. So I've made sure my needle's coming out at the very point of the blue, and I'm pulling in the direction that that corner is pointing. And now I can come down, and I'm going down exactly the same hole. I'm pivoting around that corner and making 3 stitches in the same hole essentially. So I'm going back down in the same corner, and this time I'm going to come out at a right angle on my new side, and so I've got that little diamond pattern in the corner there that allows me to rotate around that corner really neatly, and I just carry on all the way around, and you can see I've done my second patch in exactly the same way. Now at this point I want to join my blocks together because some of my flowers on my garland are going to overlap this seam, and so I have measured a 1 centimetre seam allowance in from the right hand side of my green block, what will be my right hand side, and again we did this technique last week. So what I don't want to do is line up the edges of the fabrics, because I want to make sure that my blue seam is compensating for any problems with measuring. So what I'm lining up here are the 2 lines that I've drawn. That's why we marked our seam allowance on the blue and we've marked it on the green. And what I'm doing is making sure those lines are meeting rather than the edges. So I can then open up, once I've put my pins in, I can open it up and just make sure that the lines are meeting on the inside, and that makes sure that my finished block sizes are going to be really precise. So now I've got some machine cotton, I've just knotted the end and I'm going to back stitch my way along those lines. So again, we covered this last week. You come up a stitch length in from the edge and then work back to the right to form your stitch, and then you rock forward to the left a stitch length beyond your previous stitch, and then work back to the right to meet the stitch you've just made. And you just work your way along like that. Try and keep your stitches nice and small, because these are going to be the main joins between your blocks and you don't want gaping holes. So you want small regular stitches. If you prefer to, you can whiz this through a machine and that'll make it really quick. So I'm just going to back stitch all the way along and then we'll look at the next stage. So I've done my back stitching now and I want to press my seam. Now if I press to the right, I've run the risk of that dark green fabric showing through. It is much darker than the blue, and so I'm going to press this seam to the left. So I'm always pressing to the darker fabric, and you can see that I'm just pulling it ever so slightly with my left hand as I iron, and that makes sure the seam is opened out really nice and flat. So I'm just pressing that seam over to the left, and then I can flip it and just press it on the front as well, just to make sure the seam is perfectly flat and open. So I've repeated my Bondaweb process with my flower shapes. I've just used my week 8 pattern to trace some flower shapes onto my Bondaweb, and I've pressed them onto my fabric scraps, and I'm just continuing to add flowers to my flower garland. So I think I'm going to get 4 on the bottom line and maybe 3 on the top line. So I've just positioned those in. They're not ironed on. I've just laid them out just so that I can check the balance of colours and the positioning of the flowers, and when I'm happy I can press those down. And now my finishing touch is to add the flower centres, and I've done that in exactly the same way. Just trace the flower centres onto Bondaweb, press those onto my fabric, and you can see I'm now cutting them out and ironing them on. So that's how it's looking so far. I'm absolutely loving the way this is working out, and you can see I've put in my garland line, my stem line now with a white heat erase pen. It shows up much better. I just wanted you to be able to see the sort of line of the flowers. You can see that it arcs around really nicely, and we haven't had to have 3 separate templates. We have eyeballed this, so it is perfectly possible. So what I want to do now is stitch in the stems, and we've been using chain stitch for this, and I'm just double checking which direction my stitches are formed in. So the top of the stitch is on the right hand side. So what I'm doing here is I've opened up the chain of the last stitch on the blue block. I've got 2 strands of my mid green here. I've brought my thread up inside that chain, and I've taken my needle back down at the same point. I'm just checking on the back that the seam is lying flat, that I haven't pulled the seam up, and I'm going to make my loop, bring my needle through that loop and pull it tight. And because I've come up inside that last stitch, it looks like this stem was stitched all in one go. So that's a really neat way of joining up sections of chain stitch. If you just start your stitch inside the last stitch of the previous chain, it will look seamless. And then I just carry on and stitch along my line in chain stitch up to the edge of my flower. And just like before, I'm not going to leave a big trailing thread. I'm going to finish off my thread and then restart for the next section of stem. So I'm up to the edge of my flower, I'm hopping over that last loop to just put a little anchor stitch in to hold that last chain in place, and then I can flip it over and finish off my thread on the back. And I'm just going to put in the rest of those stems in exactly the same way. So I've put in all my stems now. All I've got left to do is add in my running stitch. So you can see on that pale blue block that I've followed a colour scheme all the way along. So where I've used red fabric, I've put in yellow stitching. My yellow fabric has got blue stitching. My blue stripe has got pink stitching. My blue fabric has got white stitching. I've put all of those in, and all I've got left now is my red stitching on my pink flowers and middles. So again, I'm using running stitch. I've got 2 strands of my red embroidery thread, and I'm just working just inside that pink shape, trying to keep it fairly even. You can see I've kept a fairly even border on each of those flowers. And again, just like we did with the pattern fabric on our little patch motifs, I'm just running stitching around. Now we have got lots of layers here. We've got 3 layers of fabric and 2 layers of bondweb on this flower middle, and so because of that I do find it easier to work my running stitches in 2 motions. So I bring the needle up and then push the needle back down rather than hooking the fabric. I find I get a better finish, and so I'm just going to add in the rest of those stitches and then we'll come back and look at the finished piece. So here's our block from today with our 2 little stamp or windows and our flower garlands, and this is the trio of blocks, and I am so happy with the way this has turned out. This is going to be one of, I think, 3 flower garland sections that we're going to have across our quilt, and I just love the way the colours work together. I think the first one seemed a bit muted, but now we've got the bright yellow and the bright green on the left and the right. I think it's really lifted it and brought this section of quilt to life, and it's giving us a sense of how this quilt is going to look once we've put our blocks together. So I hope you've enjoyed that this week. If you have enjoyed this video, please do give us a like. It really helps us out. It helps other people find our channel. I can't wait to see your trios once they're done. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you create. Do share your creations at #FSH23quilt, and that way we can see them all together. Don't forget to put the hashtag in. I will put a similar project down here, and I'll put a video up here that is best for you. If you'd like to subscribe, we'd love to have you as part of our little community. It means so much to us. Just click on our logo down here. It makes it really easy for you. That's it for this week. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great week, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.